So, you want to play a big sea creature deck in Commander? Well then, you've come to the right place. In this video, I'll teach you everything you need to know about building and playing a sea creature deck in Commander. We'll cover who the archetype's dedicated commanders are, some honorable mentions for fringe sea creature commanders, and how to play and or build the ones that I find the most fun or I think have the most potential. Before I go too far, if you find this video helpful, please consider subscribing. We're a small channel and it helps out a lot. Before we get this ball rolling, let me clarify a few things. When I say sea creatures, I'm referring to 4 specific creature types: octopuses, krakens, leviathans, and serpents. Ever since Wizards printed Quest for Ula's Temple in 2010, these 4 creature types have been treated like their own separate type, getting sparse support cards between sets once or twice a year. Now, when it comes to commanders that specifically list these 4 creature types, there's actually only 3 options. But before we get to the big 3, let me cover some of my honorable mentions. These are commanders that don't actually list Leviathan, Kraken, Octopus, or Serpent in their text, but could still arguably be used as commanders for decks themed around them. Alright, let's get my obviously biased opinion out of the way. I think Glarb is the best option for pseudo sea creature commanders. I'm not going to go into too much detail in this video about why I think that is, because if you want to find out, I have 2 long-form videos that already exist and an entire short series about how much I love this deck. It's the majority of content that exists currently on the channel, and I'd highly recommend it. I've worked real hard on it. Moving on, let me talk about what I think is the second best option for a pseudo sea creature commander. And that, my friends, is Marvo Deep Operative. He's a unique Dimir Octopus commander that cares a lot about top deck manipulation and specializes in casting big splashy spells. He really comes online when you have setup cards like Brainstorm or Scroll Rack, and can just take over the board if he's allowed to swing once or twice. Not to mention, being in Dimir, he can run some of the lesser known sea creatures, like Rexiel the Risen Deep and Lochmere Serpent, one of my personal favorites. And of course, being a commander that doesn't get hit by your own Whelming Wave is always a plus side, because that's a card that you're going to include in every sea creature deck you make, bar maybe 1 or 2. 2 more honorable mentions include Arixpathy's Slumbering Isle and the new Sin, Spyra's Punishment. Both of these creatures I think fall into the same issue where they're both amazing creatures in and of their own rights. However, their playstyles and build-arounds facilitate more building around them as creatures and less so building around the creature type they belong to. I believe this same principle also applies to cards like Coma the Cosmos Serpent and Rexiel the Risen Deep. Their effects are just too game warping for you to build around anything other than them. By the way, I mentioned Whelming Wave a little bit earlier in the video. There are quite a few number of staple cards that have been printed for specifically sea creatures that you're going to end up including into pretty much any deck you build for the strategy, no matter what commander you end up going with. Now, because the majority of sea creatures are in some form of blue, whether that be pure blue, Simic, or Dimir, most of these staple cards are going to be mono blue. They include cards like Serpents of Yawning Depths and Whelming Wave, of course, Spawning Kraken, and the new Summon Leviathan that was printed from the Final Fantasy set. That last one in particular is extremely good because it's card draw, a one-sided board wipe, and a version of Whelming Wave on a body that doesn't hit merfolk, which are 2 out of the 3 main commanders for this archetype. Speaking of which, let's start talking about those main 3 options. First, I want to talk about the only Dimir option out of those 3, and the first one that I actually started with. That's Runo Stromkirk, baby! So, on Runo's front side, he's a vampire cleric that says when he enters the battlefield, you can stack any creature from your graveyard to the top of your library. Then, on your upkeep, you can reveal a 6 CMC or higher creature and transform Runo. On his backside, Runo transforms into Crothus, Lord of the Deep. He's still flying, however, now he's a Kraken Horror 3/5, and whenever he attacks, you create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of another target attacking creature that you control. If that creature's a Kraken, Leviathan, Octopus, or Serpent, create 2 of those tokens instead. This deck is all about top deck manipulation to get Runo to flip as often as you can, to make sure that you're not just sitting there flying blind hoping that there's a big creature on the top of your library, and making sure you can swing out as fast as possible with another creature in order to get as much value out of him as possible. Now, getting Runo to flip and keeping him that way without letting him get removed is not an easy task, so you're going to want to be playing a lot of different boots and a lot of different counterspells in order to protect him. However, the most obvious option for this is normally Lightning Greaves. But I personally have stopped running Lightning Greaves in my Runo build, because it has Shroud, and Runo specifically has to target the creature that he wants to copy. So giving that creature Lightning Greaves to give them Shroud and Haste won't work if you want to swing with that creature in Runo and copy it, because he won't be able to target your own card. Another direction you could build Runo, actually, is getting him to flip as fast as possible, and then playing a 4-cost copy spell that ignores Legendary Rule. That way you can swing out and those copies make copies of each other, which also ignore Legendary Rule, and eventually you just take over the board in a couple of turns. Now, The reason I've actually stopped playing the deck this way is because it seemed just kind of sacky and you end up winning the game if you just have the right combination of cards and nobody has an out to it. So it's just not as fun, in my personal opinion, but at the end of the day, you can build the deck how you want. Now, a card that does facilitate a similar win con, but that I've actually kept in the deck, is Roaming Throne. I didn't just keep in Roaming Throne to have Runo copy it at an exponential rate and win the game by turn 6. I kept Roaming Throne in because it can actually double Runo's triggers on other creatures than just itself. Now yes, ideally, I would just copy Roaming Throne because that can just win the game in a couple of turns. But that's not my only option, so I find it to be a little more interesting than playing a card like, let's say, Sakashima. Some of the strongest sea creature cards for Runo to copy are Spawning Kraken, Summon Leviathan, and Hullbreaker Horror. But having said that, if you take a look at Runo's options for the sea creatures that you can include and the ones he can copy, a lot of them are good, but even more of them are straight up terrible.
Oh! Ew! Dude! What the fuck?
Now this is partially because Runo's in Dimir, and some of the heaviest hitting and most impactful sea creatures in Commander are in Simic. Cards like the two Comas and AC are just completely out of Runo's reach because he doesn't include green. But even if he did, you still couldn't run those creatures. Why? Because they're legendary. The copies that Runo makes don't ignore legendary rules. And while that's more restrictive for the creatures that you can choose, there are some of those that don't actually care all that much, like Gyruda, who you really only care about getting off his ETB effect. So after you've made the two copies that immediately get sacked to legendary rule, they've pretty much served their purpose. However, that restriction hits cards like Marvo and Rexiel, two cards that I would love to include in this deck, because they just have anti-synergy with Runo given the fact that you cannot copy them. So I end up not running them in my personal build. Can you still run them because they have some synergies? Absolutely, but for me personally, I like making the deck to play around Runo, and those two cards just don't really fit the bill when it comes to him. So this leaves you with two options for your menagerie of big creatures. You can either make them all sea creatures and have a few of them be a little bit more of duds than others, or you can have about half of them, or a little bit more than half, be sea creatures, and have a few good, just generically good 6 or higher costs in the deck to help pad out the space. I personally went with the second option. Runo has a lot of options when it comes to 6-cost non-sea creature cards that you could include in the build. Two of which I feel like are honorary sea creatures because even though their creature types aren't listed, they feel like they should be, are Crabomination and Waker of Waves. These two cards both should absolutely get double triggered by Runo, but they don't, and that I feel is criminal. There are 3 other cards, however, that while don't exactly thematically match Runo's energy, I think are just absolutely too good not to play them in any Runo build. One is Calidus Assassin. Calidus Assassin is a 6-cost Dimir creature that you can flash in at instant speed. It comes in tapped and is a copy of any creature on the battlefield, and when it enters the battlefield, it destroys up to 1 target creature with the same name as this card. It's fantastic. Not only do you take the best thing off of one of your opponent's board and kill their version of it, but then, since it has flash, you can flash it in on the end step before you untap with a flipped Runo, and swing with whatever creature that you copied because it won't have summoning sickness. Troll of Khazad-dûm is just a really nice way for you to not miss a land drop and also get Runo to flip very early. Not to mention he doesn't say basic swamps, you can search a Surveil land or a Shock land if you need mana fixing. And Metamorphosis Fanatic is an extremely easy way to revive a creature and get a really good copy for Runo right onto the battlefield as soon as possible. The last thing I want to mention about Runo is even though he is a reanimator deck, sometimes you don't always have those cards in your hand, since Runo's not actually facilitating any reanimation from the command zone. So while I do build him to lean into reanimation, I also build him with a good amount of ramp that's facilitated by Runo himself. What I mean by that is, there's a lot of sword cards that if you end up hitting an opponent will allow you to ramp exponentially, that I ended up including since Runo is innately flying. Cards like the new Buster Sword, Sword of Feast and Famine, and Dowsing Dagger are my 3 favorite that I've included in the build. Alright, I've yapped enough about Runo. Let's move on to one of the other 2. Now these 2 are the Simic merfolk that I mentioned a little bit earlier in the video. I'm going to start off with what I consider is the weaker of the 2, and that's Kiora, Sovereign of the Deep. Kiora is a 5-cost 4/5 merfolk with Vigilance and Ward 3, and she says whenever you cast a sea creature out of your hand, look at the top X cards of your library where X is the CMC of that spell. Then, you may cast a spell out of the cards that you've looked at that has a CMC X or less. Now I'll be honest, I actually haven't built a Kiora Sovereign of the Deep deck. Or rather, as I'm making this video, I'm in the process of building one. Part of the reason I never actually ended up playing her is because 5-cost commanders always seem just a little too high for my taste. Because yes, even though she has Ward 3, A person could just kill her out of spite by paying that extra 3 mana, or she could just get caught up in a board wipe that wasn't even meant for her. And at that point, by turn 6, you have to find a way to spend 7 mana to get your commander back. It's not a position I like to be in. However, I think the commander's fun enough that I just want to build her anyway, so here's some tips and tricks as to how I would go about that, or rather, how I am going about that. Kiora specifically gives you a bonus for casting these creatures, not cheating them in, so cards like Monstrous Vortex and Kozilek's Unsealing, I think are 2 cards that, while they don't really go in the other 2 builds I'm going to be talking about, fit perfectly into this build. And once again, when it comes to sea creature commanders, top deck is king. Having cards like Brainstorm or Brain Surge in order to stack the best card on top of your library in order to cast it for free with this commander is just fantastic. Not to mention, unlike Runo, you don't care about the legendary rule since you're not trying to copy these guys. So cards like the 2 Comas and AC are completely fair game and some of the heaviest hitters in this deck. Some more cards that trigger off of casting that I think are must includes are Up the Beanstalk, Gwenna Eyes of Gaia, and Benthic Anomaly, considering they all have extreme synergy with the commander. Not to mention, Benthic Anomaly I think is just a card that is really fun to me and is entirely underutilized by the majority of the commander community. This creature is a 7 mana 7/8 Eldrazi Serpent that has Devoid, and when you cast this spell, for each opponent, choose a creature that player controls. You create a token that's a copy of one of those creatures, except its power and toughness is equal to the total power and toughness of all of those creatures. Oh, and it's a colorless Eldrazi creature. I know that was a lot to follow, so here's an example. Let's say your opponents have a Lazav, a Galta, and a 1/1 bird token. You can make a copy of one of those creatures with the stat line of 16/16. Most of the time, if the combined power and toughness is big enough, the creature you'll choose to copy will just be one of them with evasion. Now I know what you're thinking. Jacob, you can't include Lazav in this example. He has hexproof. Ah, but that's just it, dear viewer. This lovely card says choose, not target. So I don't care how many pairs of shiny new shoes a creature has, he can and will get copied. Now I get that 7 mana might be a bit overcosted for this effect. There are some cards that nearly win you the game for that same amount of mana, but this card has 2 big advantages. One, the main effect of this card is actually a cast trigger, meaning if you counter this card, the copy effect will still go off. And secondly, as well as more importantly, this effect can lead to some hilarious board states, so I love it. As much as I love Benthic Anomaly, let's move on to some more good cards for Kiora. Once again, because you're focused on casting these creatures, not cheating them in any other way, cards like Goreclaw and Thrix the Sudden Storm get a lot more viable. Not to mention, sea creatures with flash like Elder Deep Fiend or Hullbreaker Horror can end up being a counterspell when you need it thanks to your commander's ability. And lastly, a card that I think doesn't see nearly enough play as it should, and should be an auto-include in any deck that has this as its commander, Smuggler's Surprise. I love this instant speed card because you can either use it to protect your board, get advantage when you need it, or you can use it to cheat out 2 big creatures from your hand, or if you have a ton of mana to spend, you can do all 3. Alright, let's move on to our 3rd commander, and that commander is Kenessos, Priest of Thassa. Kenessos is the cheapest commander that we're going to be talking about today at just 2 mana. He's a Merfolk Cleric 1/3 that says whenever you would scry that many times +1. He has an activated for 3 generic and a blue or a green. You may look at the top card of your library, and if it's a sea creature, you may put it straight onto the battlefield. If not, you may leave it there or put it on the bottom of your library. Out of your 2 Simic options for sea creature themed commanders, I think Kenessos is probably the stronger one when compared to Kiora. That's mostly because when you have big creature strategies like this, and you need to get them into play, if you're going to cast them, you better have a very good setup in order to do so. If you're not Eldrazi's, you're probably not going to be able to cast some of the bigger creatures that you end up wanting to play. So Kenessos, using scrying and other types of top deck manipulation, is a very well-designed way to cheat them out of the library. Not to mention, in Simic there are plenty of other cards to reduce that activated ability, so it's costing you either 2 or even 1 mana to use. And that's 1 to 2 mana you can use on an instant speed ability to cheat in a giant 6 or 7 cost creature. The way that I personally build Kenessos is sort of like pseudo landfall. Because the deck wants to be scrying multiple times a turn, leaning into the landfall sub-theme does it very well. With cards like Merit Lodge's Slumber and Retreat to Coraline, you'll never find an issue getting to scry in a turn through a land drop. But there's one card that you can include in this deck that's a huge payoff for both of those enchantments, and that's Galadriel of Lothlorien. Sorry if I mispronounced that, by the way. Zach was the local Lord of the Rings lore fan. I was just there for the vibes. But yeah, her ability saying that whenever you scry, you basically can reveal the top card of your library afterwards, and if it's a land, it goes straight on the battlefield, in conjunction with one of these 2 enchantments, can get you 6 or 7 lands out of your deck if you end up getting lucky. And aside from those lands just meaning extra mana, they can have added benefits with cards like Grappling Kraken or Icebreaker Kraken. Or they can have a lot more of an impactful benefit through cards like Tatiova Benthic Druid or AC, Tyrant of Gyre Strait. Now, I don't want to get too in-depth into the nitty-gritty of cards that you already know are good for this commander. Anything that you'd see on the top cover of EDHREC, I don't really feel the compulsion to cover because you don't need me to tell you that card's good in that deck. It's right there. However, what I do see value in explaining is why some of those cards are on EDHREC in the first place, and what little interactions they might have that you might not have noticed. For instance, it's no secret that having a card that lets you know the top card of your library at all times would be extremely useful in Kenessos, but because of that, having cards that allow you to instantly draw are just as useful. Now, the obvious ones that come to mind are cards like Preordain that scry and draw, but other ones that I think are underrated in Kenessos are cards like Kenra's Transformation that not only double as removal, but can also draw you a card when you know the top card of your library isn't something that you want there. But you know what's better than just knowing the top card of your library? Being able to cast it or play lands off the top if you find them there. That's why cards like Reality Chip and Elven Chorus are must-includes in my opinion. Not to mention, since Kenessos' ability happens at instant speed, you can build around this type of effect by putting in a lot of small instant speed removal spells that you can cycle through at the end step before your turn, and then check the top card of your library to see if it's a sea creature to use Kenessos' ability in order to cheat it right into play. Now, obviously cards that allow you to untap your lands at either your end step or other people's upkeep, like Wilderness Reclamation or Seedborn Muse, are going to be insane in this deck. I would say I stick with cards like Wilderness Reclamation because Seedborn Muse seems a little bit too high octane for what I'm looking to do, but again, to each their own. If you want to go that hard in the paint when it comes to this deck, by all means, throw in Seedborn Muse. Alright, let's talk about board wipes. Now, we've already covered two similar one-sided board wipes that Sea Creature Tribal has access to, but we haven't even mentioned the third that comes with a body. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, Scourge of Fleets. Now, there are two main weaknesses with this card that I've identified while playing with it. One, it's 7 mana, and that's a lot. We've already covered earlier in this video how 7 mana can sometimes win you the game, so paying that much for a board wipe is a lot to ask. And two, this card is a lot better suited when you're in mono blue because it relies on the amount of islands you control. However, when you run this card in Kenessos, both of those weaknesses pretty much get circumvented. As far as its cost goes, most of the time you're going to be cheating this off the top of your library for 4 mana. And as far as having enough islands goes, Kenessos ramps so much that the odds of you not having enough islands to bounce a good amount of your opponent's board is extremely unlikely. So yeah, I'd put Scourge of Fleets on the same level as Whelming Wave in this deck. Speaking of which, Whelming Wave still has a good amount of synergy with your deck despite the fact that it bounces your commander, considering your commander is only 2 more mana to cast again. You find that drawback actually is a lot more felt when you play it in a deck like Kiora or even Glarb in the build that I have. For Kiora, you're going to have to pay a full 5 mana to recast her, and in Glarb's case, yes, he only costs 3 to recast, but he has a tap ability that you're going to miss out on because he has Summoning Sickness. Lastly, I round off our lineup of one-sided board wipes with Curse of Swine. Honestly, this will probably be the most off-theme card of the entire video. There's no explicit reason why Curse of Swine is better in Kenessos or pretty much any Sea Creature deck compared to other blue decks. I just really like this card. I think it's extremely good and undervalued, and I don't see it nearly as much as I would expect to. I suppose one added benefit you could identify is that with all the other one-sided bounce board wipes that we have, odds are, even if you give your opponent a ton of 2/2 pig tokens, they likely won't be able to keep them for very long. So between the new Summon Leviathan, Scourge of Fleets, Whelming Wave, and Curse of Swine, you're never going to be hurting for one-sided board wipes. See, who even needs Cyclonic Rift? Get that out of here! One card that I think is really underrated for Kenessos, and in Commander in general is underrated, is Noxious Revival. You can stack the best creature for free from your graveyard to the top of your library, and then use Kenessos' ability to cheat it out. Not to mention, Kenessos aside, you could just use this card to get the best card out of your graveyard as a specific answer to a problem on the board. I also want you to take note of the fact that this card does not say stack a card from your graveyard, it says stack a card from a graveyard to the top of their owner's library. Something that a lot of people might not know is that if your opponent uses a Reanimate or an Animate Dead, you can actually use this card in response, targeting the creature they're attempting to revive, and stack it to the top of their library, making the revival spell fizzle. Or if you're really desperate, you can blank your opponent's draw by giving them a bunk card from their graveyard to the top of their library. So yeah, this card is extremely versatile, and thanks to its mana cost, it's never dead. The only reason I don't personally run that is because I like to keep Kenessos with as little reanimation or recursion as possible, because I like the theming being that you keep going deeper and deeper into the ocean and seeing newer and newer creatures. I also strayed away from that because the last 2 Sea Creature decks I made had a lot of recursion and reanimation, so I figured it'd be a little more fun if I strayed away from that for this build. In terms of facilitating card card draw for both Kenessos and Kiora, I think cards like Garruk's Uprising and Elemental Bond are a must-include considering you're a creature-based strategy. You can also throw in Guardian Project, but I think it's a little bit too high-costed for nowadays. That about sums up my tips on Kenessos. So, to recap, let's rank the 3 main sea creature commanders now. To no one's surprise, sadly Kiora is last. Like we'd said previously, her mana cost is just too high and the payoff just isn't there for what she demands of you. But that being said, her capability to storm value into value is not to be underestimated. And second, we have Runo Stromkirk. If you want to have a really fun build-around commander that has a good amount of sea creature synergies, but you can also build him in other directions, Runo's your guy. But I just can't put him ahead of Kenessos given the fact that Kenessos has access to a lot of the much stronger sea creatures, and that Runo is so fragile if someone hits him with removal. And in first place, of course, we have Kenessos. He has everything going for him. He's low CMC, he has high synergy mechanics, and you're able to spam out sea creature after sea creature if you build the deck properly and have the right enablers. So I guess that settles it. By all metrics, Kenessos is the best sea creature commander. But what's this? Who's coming from backstage? Is that... Can it be? Yes, it is! Glob Calamity's Augur with a steel chair! And there you have it, folks. Our #1 sea creature commander for this video, Glob Calamity's Augur, is your world heavyweight champion! Alright, that about wraps up my guide for how to play sea creatures in Commander. Out of all the commanders I went over, which one caught your eye? And if you're gonna end up building one, link your Mox field in a comment below and I'll check it out. Also be sure to comment down below if there's any cards or commanders that you think I missed. I'd be more than happy to make a part 2 for the sea creature guide if I think it's worth it. Aside from that, thanks for sticking around to the end of the video, and I hope to see you in a future one. See you guys later!